The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Vatican City as Michael Harrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform one last time. He had been serving as a British Royal Guard for nearly 15 years, but this assignment was different from anything he had experienced before. The Pope had specifically requested his presence, though Michael couldn't understand why. Michael was a man of discipline and duty. His father had been a soldier, his grandfather too. The military life ran through his veins like an old family recipe passed down through generations. He stood at attention outside the Pope's private chambers, his mind wandering to his childhood in a small village outside London. Growing up, Michael had never been particularly religious. His family attended church on Christmas and Easter, like many British families did, but faith wasn't something they discussed over dinner. His mother would sometimes pray quietly before bed, but his father believed in hard work and honor more than divine intervention. Michael had inherited that practical mindset. The Vatican's Swiss Guard commander had briefed him earlier that morning. Pope Francis had fallen seriously ill during the night. The doctors were doing everything they could, but the situation was grave. The Pope had asked for several people to be brought to his bedside, and surprisingly, Michael's name was on that list. Michael shifted his weight slightly, careful not to break his professional stance. He remembered the first time he had met the Pope 3 years ago. It was during a state visit when the British royal family had come to the Vatican. Michael had been part of the security detail, standing in the background as diplomats and religious leaders exchanged pleasantries and formal greetings. What happened that day had been unexpected. During a quiet moment in the Vatican gardens, Michael had been stationed near a fountain when the Pope approached him. Most high-ranking officials walked past guards as if they were invisible furniture. But Pope Francis had stopped and smiled warmly. "You look troubled." "My son," the Pope had said in his accented English. Michael had been startled. He was trained to remain expressionless, but something in the Pope's gentle eyes had caught him off guard. "I'm fine, Your Holiness," he had replied stiffly. The Pope had chuckled softly. "Even the strongest soldiers carry burdens. I can see it in your eyes." Michael hadn't known how to respond. The truth was he had been troubled. His younger brother James had been struggling with addiction back in England. The family was falling apart trying to help him, and Michael felt helpless being so far away, unable to do anything meaningful. "Sometimes," the Pope had continued, "we think we must carry everything alone. But that's not how we were meant to live. Even the strongest bridge needs many pillars." Those words had stayed with Michael long after that brief encounter. In the months that followed, he had found himself thinking about them during difficult times. The Pope hadn't offered solutions or preached at him. He had simply seen Michael as a human being, not just a uniform standing at attention. Now, standing outside the Pope's chambers 3 years later, Michael wondered if the Pope even remembered that conversation. There had been thousands of people the Pope must have met since then. Why would he remember one British guard? The heavy wooden door opened and a nun gestured for Michael to enter. His heart began to beat faster as he walked into the dimly lit room. Medical equipment beeped softly in the corner. Several priests stood in quiet prayer near the window. And there, in a simple bed, lay Pope Francis. The Pope looked smaller than Michael remembered, more fragile. His skin was pale and his breathing seemed labored. But when his eyes found Michael's face, they lit up with recognition and warmth. "Ah, Michael," the Pope whispered, his voice weak but clear. "You came." Michael approached the bedside, unsure of the proper protocol. Should he kneel? Should he remain standing? In the end, he simply moved closer, his military training giving way to simple human compassion. "Your Holiness, I'm here," Michael said, his voice catching slightly. The Pope smiled and reached out a trembling hand. Michael hesitated for just a moment before taking it gently. The Pope's hand was cold, and Michael could feel how thin and fragile it had become. "Do you remember our conversation in the garden?" the Pope asked. Michael nodded, surprised that the Pope had indeed remembered. "I do, Your Holiness." "Every word, your brother," the Pope said. "How is James?" Michael's eyes widened. How did the Pope remember his brother's name? He had only mentioned it once 3 years ago in a brief conversation that had lasted barely 5 minutes. "He's better, Your Holiness," Michael replied, his voice thick with emotion. "He's been clean for 2 years now. He's rebuilding his life." The Pope's face brightened with genuine joy despite his obvious pain. "God is good," he whispered. "I have prayed for him many times. For both of you." Michael felt tears forming in his eyes. Here was a man who had met thousands upon thousands of people, who had carried the weight of millions of souls on his shoulders, and yet he had remembered one guard's struggling brother. He had prayed for them. "Your Holiness, I don't understand," Michael said quietly. "Why did you ask for me? There must be so many others more important." The Pope squeezed Michael's hand with surprising strength. "That's exactly why I asked for you, my son. Because you think you're not important. Because the world has taught you that only certain people matter, only certain voices should be heard." Michael listened, his professional composure completely gone now. He was no longer a guard standing at attention. He was simply a man, listening to another man who had something vital to say. "I asked you here because 3 years ago, I saw a good man carrying a heavy burden," the Pope continued. "I saw someone who loved his brother enough to hurt for him. I saw someone who stood strong even when his heart was breaking. That kind of love, that kind of loyalty, that is what truly matters in this world." The Pope paused to catch his breath, and a nurse stepped forward with concern. But the Pope waved her away gently, determined to finish what he needed to say. "Michael, I am dying," the Pope said with calm acceptance. "The doctors have told me this is my final day on earth, and I realize that in these last moments I didn't want to be surrounded only by cardinals and politicians. I wanted to be surrounded by people who reminded me why life is precious. People like you." Michael couldn't hold back his tears anymore. They streamed down his face as he held the Pope's hand. This man who had shown him that every person mattered, that even a guard standing in the background was seen and valued. The Pope gestured weakly toward a chair beside his bed, and Michael sat down, still holding the elderly man's hand. Outside the window, the sounds of Vatican City continued as normal. Tourists walked through St. Peter's Square, unaware that history was unfolding in this quiet room. Birds sang in the gardens where Michael and the Pope had first spoken 3 years earlier. "Tell me about your life, Michael," the Pope said softly. "Not the official version that's written in your personnel file. Tell me about the real you, the person behind the uniform." Michael wasn't used to talking about himself. His entire career had been about discipline, about following orders, about being part of something larger than himself. But something about the Pope's genuine interest made the words flow naturally. He told the Pope about growing up in a small village where everyone knew everyone else's business. He described his father, a stern but loving man who had taught him to stand up for what was right. He talked about his mother, who made the best shepherd's pie in all of England and who cried every time Michael left after visiting home. The Pope listened with complete attention, occasionally nodding or smiling. Despite his obvious pain and weakness, he was fully present in the conversation, as if nothing else in the world mattered except hearing Michael's story. Michael found himself sharing things he had never told anyone before. He talked about the fear he felt the first time he stood guard during a major international event, certain he would make a mistake and embarrass himself. He described the loneliness of being stationed far from home, missing family celebrations and important moments. "And your brother James," the Pope prompted gently. "Tell me more about him." Michael's expression changed, becoming both pained and proud. James was 3 years younger than Michael, and they had been inseparable as children. James had been the creative one, always drawing or playing music, while Michael had been the responsible older brother who made sure they didn't get into too much trouble. "He started using drugs when he was 19, Michael explained, his voice heavy with old grief. "At first we didn't notice. He was good at hiding it, but then he lost his job and his girlfriend left him, and everything fell apart so quickly." The Pope squeezed Michael's hand, encouraging him to continue. "I was stationed overseas when it got really bad," Michael said. "My mother would call me crying, saying James had disappeared for days. My father tried to be tough about it, said James needed to face consequences, but I could hear the fear in his voice too. I felt so useless, so far away, unable to help the person I loved most in the world." Michael paused, swallowing hard. "That's why I was troubled the day you met me in the garden. I had just gotten a call that James was in the hospital. They weren't sure he would survive. I was preparing to request emergency leave to go home, but I didn't know if I would make it in time to say goodbye." "But he survived," the Pope said, his eyes warm with compassion. "He did." Michael nodded. And when I got home, he was different. Something about that near-death experience had shaken him awake. He agreed to go to rehabilitation. It was the hardest thing our family ever went through, watching him fight that battle. The Pope was quiet for a moment, and Michael could see he was tiring, but there was something else in his expression, something that looked like peace. "Michael, do you know why I remember you and your brother so clearly?" the Pope asked. Michael shook his head. "Because when you told me about James that day in the garden, I saw something beautiful," the Pope explained. "I saw a brother's love that was so strong it transcended distance and duty. You were willing to leave your post, to risk your career, to be with your brother in his darkest hour. That is the kind of love that changes the world." Michael had never thought about it that way. He had always felt guilty about wanting to leave his duty, ashamed that he couldn't be strong enough to stay at his post regardless of personal circumstances. "In my many years serving the church," the Pope continued, "I have learned that God doesn't measure us by our titles or positions. He measures us by how we love. A royal guard who loves his brother is no less important than a pope who leads millions. In fact, that pure, selfless love is exactly what the world needs most." A nurse entered quietly to check the Pope's vital signs. She frowned at the readings but said nothing, respecting the Pope's wishes to continue his conversations. Michael noticed her concerned expression and realized with a heavy heart that time was running short. "Your Holiness," Michael said hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, my son. How do you do it?" Michael asked. "How do you remember everyone?" "How do you make each person feel like they matter when you meet thousands of people?" The Pope smiled, and for a moment the pain seemed to lift from his face. "It's quite simple, actually. I remember because I truly see them. When I meet someone, I'm not thinking about the next appointment or the speech I need to give. I'm present with that person in that moment. And when you truly see someone, really see them, they become unforgettable." Michael thought about all the times he had stood at attention, looking straight ahead, trained not to make eye contact or engage with the people passing by. He had been taught to be invisible, to blend into the background, but the Pope had taught him something different. The Pope had taught him that being present, being truly human, was more important than any protocol. "After you told me about James," the Pope continued, "I added his name to my personal prayer list. Every morning during my private prayers, I would ask God to watch over him, to give him strength, to help him find his way back to health and happiness." Michael was overwhelmed. He had grown up thinking prayer was something people did out of habit or tradition, not really expecting results. But here was a man who had prayed daily for a stranger he had never met, simply because that stranger's brother had shared his burden for a few minutes in a garden. "Did you ever doubt?" Michael asked suddenly. "Did you ever pray and wonder if anyone was listening?" The Pope's eyes crinkled with understanding. "Every day," he admitted. "Faith is not the absence of doubt, Michael. Faith is choosing to believe even when doubt whispers in your ear. It's choosing to hope even when circumstances seem hopeless. It's choosing to love even when love seems foolish." Michael absorbed these words, feeling something shift inside him. He had spent his entire life being practical, relying on what he could see and touch and control. But watching this dying man speak about faith with such certainty, such peace, made him wonder if there was more to life than he had allowed himself to believe. The afternoon light began to fade outside the window, casting the room in a softer golden glow. More people had been quietly entering and leaving the Pope's chambers throughout the day, each person spending a few precious moments with him. Michael had been there for hours now, and the Pope had insisted he stay. Between visitors, they continued to talk. The Pope asked Michael about his dreams, his hopes for the future. Michael found himself sharing things he had barely admitted to himself. He talked about wanting to settle down someday, maybe have a family of his own. He expressed his fear that he had spent so much time being a soldier that he didn't know how to be anything else. "You are more than your uniform," the Pope assured him. "The uniform is what you wear, not who you are. The compassion you showed your brother, the loyalty to your family, the dedication to your duty, these qualities will serve you well in any path you choose." A cardinal entered and whispered something to the Pope. The Pope nodded slowly, and the cardinal left to make some arrangements. Michael sensed that decisions were being made, final preparations for what was coming. "Michael," the Pope said, his voice growing weaker, "I want to tell you why I really asked you here today." Michael leaned closer, not wanting to miss a single word. When a person reaches the end of their life, they think about what truly mattered, the Pope began. Not the ceremonies or the official duties, but the moments of real human connection. That day in the garden with you was one of those moments for me. You reminded me that beneath all the titles and traditions, we are all just human beings trying to find our way. The Pope paused to catch his breath, and Michael waited patiently. I have spent my life trying to remind people that God's love is for everyone, not just those who seem worthy or important by the world's standard, the Pope continued. But sometimes I wonder if my message truly reaches people. Do they hear it, or do they just hear another religious leader giving another sermon? Michael understood what the Pope was saying. He had heard countless religious speeches in his life, but few had touched his heart the way that simple conversation in the garden had. You showed me that my message does matter, the Pope said, his eyes glistening. You showed me that a few genuine words spoken with real care can change someone's life. You went back to your brother with renewed hope. You loved him through his darkest times, and now he is healing. That is the ripple effect of love, Michael. That is what makes life meaningful. Michael felt tears running down his face again. He had come here thinking he was just following orders, just doing his duty by responding to a dying man's request. He hadn't realized that his presence would mean something deeper, that somehow he had given something back to the Pope who had given him so much. Your Holiness, Michael said, his voice breaking, you changed my life. Before meeting you, I thought faith was for weak people who couldn't face reality, but you showed me that real faith is the strongest thing in the world. It takes courage to believe in goodness when you've seen so much suffering. It takes strength to choose love when hate seems easier. The Pope smiled broadly despite his pain. You see? You understand it perfectly. That is exactly what I have tried to teach for all these years, and hearing you say it back to me now in my final hours is one of the greatest gifts I could receive. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, the evening bells began to ring across Vatican City. The sound was beautiful and haunting, marking the passage of time in the eternal city. Michael thought about all the generations of people who had heard those same bells, all the lives that had passed through these ancient walls. Tell me about the first time you wore your uniform, the Pope said suddenly, seeming to find a second wind. Michael smiled at the memory. I was so nervous. It was during a ceremony at Buckingham Palace. I kept checking to make sure everything was perfectly in place. My commanding officer told me I looked like I had swallowed a broom. I was standing so stiffly. The Pope laughed, a genuine laugh that seemed to ease his discomfort momentarily. And now, how do you feel when you wear it? Now it feels like a second skin, Michael admitted. I barely think about it anymore. It's part of who I am. But it's not all of who you are, the Pope reminded him gently. Never forget that. The world will try to define you by your job, your status, your achievements. But you are so much more than that. You are a beloved son, a loyal brother, a good man with a kind heart. Those things matter far more than any uniform ever could. Michael nodded, absorbing this wisdom. He thought about his father, who had measured his worth by his military achievements, and his mother, who had loved him simply for being her son. He realized that the Pope was giving him permission to be both, to honor his duty while also embracing his humanity. A priest entered with some documents for the Pope to sign. Even in his final hours, there were official matters to attend to. Michael started to stand, thinking he should give the Pope privacy, but the Pope gestured for him to stay. Don't go, the Pope said. I want you here. You ground me, Michael. You remind me of what's real. Michael settled back into his chair, humbled by these words. As the Pope dealt with various official matters, Michael observed how even in extreme weakness the Pope remained gracious and thoughtful with everyone who approached him. He had a kind word for each person, a genuine interest in their well-being. After the others had left, the Pope turned back to Michael with a serious expression. I need to ask something of you, the Pope said. When I am gone, I want you to carry a message for me. Anything, Your Holiness, Michael replied immediately. Tell people about our conversation in the garden, the Pope said. Tell them that one brief moment of genuine human connection mattered. Tell them that seeing each other, really seeing each other as fellow human beings, can change everything. Michael promised he would, though he couldn't imagine how or when he would share such a story. Tell them that love is not complicated, the Pope continued. It's actually very simple. It's about being present. It's about listening. It's about caring for the person right in front of you, whether they're a king or a beggar. Everyone matters equally in God's eyes, and everyone should matter in ours too. Michael committed every word to memory, sensing the importance of this request. "And tell your brother James," the Pope added, his voice growing softer, "that I am proud of him. Tell him that his struggle was not in vain. Tell him that every day he chooses life over despair is a victory. Tell him that he has touched the heart of a pope he never met, and that I will watch over him from heaven." Michael could barely speak through his emotions. "I will tell him, Your Holiness. I promise you I will tell him." The Pope squeezed Michael's hand weakly. "Good, that brings me great peace." As darkness fell completely outside, the room took on an even more intimate atmosphere. Candles had been lit, casting dancing shadows on the ancient walls. The medical equipment continued its steady beeping, but somehow even that sound seemed to fade into the background as Michael and the Pope continued their conversation. "Do you fear death, Your Holiness?" Michael asked, surprising himself with his boldness. But the closeness they had developed over these hours made the question feel natural, rather than inappropriate. The Pope considered this thoughtfully. "I fear leaving behind people I love," he admitted. "I fear that there is still so much work to be done, so many people hurting who need comfort." "But death itself?" "No, I don't fear it. I see it as going home after a long journey." Michael tried to imagine having that kind of peace about dying. His own father had passed away 2 years earlier, and Michael remembered the fear in his eyes toward the end. His father had been a brave soldier, but facing death had terrified him. "Your father," the Pope said, as if reading Michael's thoughts. "Tell me about him." Michael had mentioned his father earlier, but hadn't gone into detail. Now he found himself sharing the complicated relationship they had shared. His father had been demanding, pushing Michael to excel in everything. There had been love there, certainly, but it had been wrapped in expectations and unspoken emotions. "Did you ever tell him you loved him?" the Pope asked gently. Michael shook his head, feeling a familiar knot of regret in his chest. "We weren't that kind of family. We showed love through actions, not words. At least that's what I told myself." "Do you wish you had told him?" the Pope pressed softly. "Every single day," Michael admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "When he was dying, I stood beside his bed and I wanted to say it. The words were right there in my throat, but I couldn't make them come out. I was so worried about breaking down, about not being strong for my mother and James, so I just held his hand and said nothing." The Pope was quiet for a long moment. "Michael, your father knew you loved him. The fact that you were there holding his hand in his final moments spoke louder than any words could have." "But what if he needed to hear it?" Michael asked, voicing the guilt he had carried for 2 years. "What if he died wondering?" "Listen to me carefully," the Pope said with gentle firmness. "Your father raised you to be a man of honor and integrity. He taught you loyalty and dedication. Every day you live those values is a declaration of your love for him. The life you lead is your tribute to him." Michael had never thought about it that way. He had been so focused on the words he didn't say that he hadn't considered how his actions spoke for him. "Besides," the Pope added with a slight smile, "I suspect your father wasn't much better at saying the words either, was he?" Michael laughed despite his tears. "No, he wasn't. The most emotional thing he ever said to me was 'well done' after I completed my military training. And I bet that 'well done' meant the world to you," the Pope said knowingly. It had. Michael had carried those 2 words with him through his entire career. Whenever things got difficult, he would remember his father's gruff voice saying, "well done," and the barely concealed pride in his eyes. "Love comes in many languages, Michael," the Pope explained. "Words are just one of them. Your father spoke love through his teachings, through his presence, through his sacrifice to give you opportunities, and you spoke love back through your dedication to making him proud. Don't diminish that kind of love just because it wasn't expressed in poetry." Michael felt something release inside him, a burden he hadn't realized he was still carrying. Maybe he and his father had communicated love perfectly well in their own way. Maybe not saying the actual words didn't mean the love was any less real. "Thank you," Michael said sincerely. "I needed to hear that," the Pope nodded. "Sometimes we need permission to forgive ourselves. I give you that permission now. Your father would not want you carrying guilt. He would want you living fully, loving openly, being the good man he raised you to be." They talked more about family, about the complex relationships that shape who we become. The Pope shared some of his own experiences growing up in Argentina, the joys and struggles of his childhood. Despite being the spiritual leader of millions, he spoke about his life with humility and honesty, never pretending he had always had all the answers. "I made many mistakes in my life," the Pope confessed. "There were times I was too harsh, too judgmental. Times I missed opportunities to show compassion because I was too focused on rules and regulations. I have spent many years trying to make amends for those mistakes." Michael was surprised to hear the Pope speak this way. He had assumed someone in such a position would be confident in all their decisions, secure in their righteousness. "The greatest lesson I learned," the Pope continued, "is that being right is far less important than being kind. I spent too many years of my priesthood being right. Only later did I understand that Jesus taught us to be loving, not to be right." This resonated deeply with Michael. He thought about his own tendency to judge others, to hold people to strict standards. He thought about the times he had been harsh with James during his addiction, more concerned with being right about the destructive path his brother was on than with offering unconditional love and support. "When James was using drugs," Michael said slowly, "I was so angry with him. I would lecture him about wasting his life, making bad choices. I thought I was helping, thought tough love was what he needed. But really I was just pushing him further away." The Pope listened with his characteristic full attention. "What changed?" the Pope asked. "That hospital stay when he almost died," Michael explained. "I realized that being right didn't matter if I lost my brother. I would rather have James alive and struggling than be right about his choices and lose him forever. So I stopped lecturing and started listening. I stopped judging and started supporting. And slowly he began to heal." "That is wisdom," the Pope said approvingly. "Real, hard-earned wisdom. Many people never learn that lesson. They go through life being right but ending up alone." A nurse came in to adjust the Pope's medication. Michael noticed how the Pope thanked her warmly, asking about her family, remembering details from previous conversations. Even in his dying hours, he practiced what he preached, seeing people, making them feel valued. After the nurse left, the Pope turned back to Michael with renewed intensity in his eyes. "Michael, I want to share something with you that I have shared with very few people," the Pope said. Michael leaned in, honored by this confidence. "When I was a young priest, I had a crisis of faith," the Pope began. "I questioned everything. I wondered if God was real, if any of this mattered. I felt like a fraud standing at the altar, leading people in prayers I wasn't sure I believed." Michael was shocked. The Pope had doubted? "What did you do?" Michael asked. "I kept showing up," the Pope said simply. "Even when I didn't feel faithful, I acted faithfully. I helped people who needed help. I listened to confessions. I performed weddings and funerals. And somewhere in the doing, the believing came back. Or maybe it had never really left. Maybe faith isn't about never doubting. Maybe it's about choosing to love and serve even when doubt screams in your ear." Michael understood this in a way he couldn't have before today. He had thought faith was about certainty, about knowing for sure. But maybe it was more about choosing to believe in goodness, choosing to act with love even when you weren't certain of anything. The night deepened around them, and Michael could see the Pope was growing increasingly tired. Yet there seemed to be an urgency in the elderly man, as if he had more he needed to say before time ran out completely. "There is something else I must tell you," the Pope said, his voice becoming strained with effort. "Something important about why you are really here." Michael waited, sensing this was the heart of what the Pope had been building toward all day. 3 years ago, after our conversation in the garden, I prayed about you and your brother," the Pope began. "And I felt strongly that you would play an important role, not just in your brother's healing, but in carrying a message forward into the world." Michael was confused. "What message, Your Holiness?" "I'm just a guard. I don't have a platform to share messages." The Pope shook his head slightly. "You don't need a platform. You need a story, and now you have one. You have witnessed a Pope's final day on earth. You have heard his last words, his deepest truths. People will want to know what happened in this room. When they ask, you will tell them." Michael began to understand. This entire day had been intentional. The Pope hadn't just wanted company in his final hours. He had been giving Michael a gift, a story, a message to carry into the world. "But what exactly should I tell them?" Michael asked, feeling the weight of this responsibility. The Pope took a labored breath. "Tell them that every single person matters. Tell them that a chance encounter can change a life. Tell them that love is stronger than death, that connection is more important than achievement, that being present with each other is the most sacred thing we can do. Michael listened intently, committing every word to memory. Tell them that a pope remembered a guard and his struggling brother because love makes everything memorable, the pope continued. Tell them that I chose to spend my last day not with the powerful and famous but with ordinary people who touched my heart. Tell them that this is what Jesus taught us, to love the least among us, and that everyone is both the least and the greatest at the same time. The door opened quietly, and a cardinal entered with several other church officials. They looked somber, and Michael understood that they had come to be present for the end. He started to rise, thinking he should give them space, but the Pope gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Stay," the Pope insisted. "Please stay until the end." Michael nodded, too emotional to speak. He was aware that he was witnessing something historic, but more than that. He was saying goodbye to someone who had become deeply important to him in just a few short hours, someone who had first touched his life 3 years ago in a garden. The cardinals and officials took positions around the room, but the Pope kept his eyes on Michael as if drawing strength from their connection. "Tell me about the future you dream of," the Pope whispered, his voice becoming weaker. Michael understood that the Pope was trying to keep him talking, wanting to spend these final moments in conversation rather than in formal prayers and ceremonies. So Michael shared his dreams. Simple dreams of a small house somewhere in the countryside, a family of his own, children who would know their Uncle James and hear stories about their grandfather. "I want to live differently than I have," Michael admitted. "I want to be present with people the way you taught me. I want to see them, really see them, the way you saw me. I want to tell people I love them instead of assuming they know." The Pope smiled, and even in his extreme weakness there was joy in his expression. "That is a beautiful legacy, Michael. That is exactly what the world needs. Not more soldiers or guards, but more people who know how to love openly and see clearly." Michael felt tears streaming down his face as he watched the Pope's breathing become more labored. The medical equipment's beeping changed its rhythm, and the nurse looked at the doctors with concern. Everyone in the room could sense that the moment was approaching. "Your Holiness," Michael said, his voice breaking, "thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for remembering James. Thank you for teaching me that it's okay to be human, that vulnerability is strength, that love matters more than anything." The Pope squeezed Michael's hand one more time. "No, Michael, thank you. Thank you for giving an old man the gift of genuine friendship in his final hours. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about a brother enough to carry that love with you wherever you went. You reminded me why I chose this life, why serving others is the greatest privilege anyone could have." The cardinals began to pray in Latin, their voices creating a solemn harmony in the candle-lit room. But the Pope kept his eyes on Michael, and Michael kept his eyes on the Pope, their connection transcending the religious ceremony happening around them. "Will you do something for me?" the Pope asked weakly. "Anything," Michael promised. "When you leave here, call your brother. Tell him about today. Tell him that he is loved, that he is valued, that his life matters. Tell him that a Pope he never met carried him in his prayers and that love has power even across distances and time." "I will," Michael promised. "I'll call him the moment I leave this room." The Pope nodded, satisfied. "And Michael, one more thing. Forgive yourself. Forgive yourself for the words you didn't say to your father. Forgive yourself for the times you weren't there for James. Forgive yourself for being human and imperfect. That forgiveness will free you to love more fully going forward." Michael felt something break open inside him, a dam that had been holding back years of guilt and regret. The tears came harder now, but they felt cleansing rather than painful. "I forgive myself," Michael said, saying the words out loud for the first time. "I forgive myself." "Good," the Pope whispered. "Now you are free." The Pope's eyes began to close and his breathing became shallow. The doctors moved closer, monitoring his vital signs. But even as his body began to fail, there was a smile on his face, a peace that radiated from him. "Michael," the Pope said, his voice barely audible now, "thank you for this gift. This beautiful gift of connection, of humanity, of love. You have made my last day on earth meaningful in ways I could never have imagined." "You've given me so much more," Michael replied, leaning close so the Pope could hear him. "You've changed my life, Your Holiness. You've taught me how to live." The Pope's smile widened slightly. "Then my work here is complete. Live well, Michael Harrison. Love well, see people, be present. That is the greatest sermon anyone could ever preach." Those were the last words Pope Francis spoke clearly, His breathing became more irregular and the medical team began their final protocols. But through it all, Michael held the Pope's hand, refusing to let go, wanting to be that anchor of human connection right up until the very end. The Cardinal's prayers grew louder, more urgent. The ancient words of faith filled the room, centuries of tradition and belief echoing off the walls. But Michael wasn't listening to the prayers. He was focused entirely on the man before him, watching his face, feeling his hand grow colder, witnessing the gradual transition from life to death. In those final moments, Michael understood something profound. Death was not an ending, but a transformation. The Pope's body might be failing, but everything he had taught, every life he had touched, every moment of genuine connection he had created, all of that would live on. Love was indeed stronger than death. At 11:43 in the evening, Pope Francis took his last breath. The room fell into profound silence. Even the medical equipment seemed to pause for a moment, as if the universe itself was acknowledging the passing of a remarkable soul. The cardinals completed their prayers and someone gently closed the Pope's eyes. Michael sat there still holding the Pope's hand, unable to let go. He felt as though if he released that hand, he would lose the connection they had built over this extraordinary day. A priest touched his shoulder gently and Michael finally opened his hand, letting the Pope's fingers slip away. He stood on unsteady legs, his body stiff from sitting in the same position for so many hours. The cardinals and officials began their formal procedures, the ancient rituals that accompanied the death of a pope. But Michael felt disconnected from all of it. His mind was replaying every conversation, every smile, every piece of wisdom the Pope had shared. A Monsignor approached Michael quietly. "The Holy Father requested that you be allowed to leave through the private exit," he said kindly. "He did not want you to face the crowds and media that will soon be gathering." Michael nodded gratefully. He wasn't ready to face the world yet. He needed time to process what had just happened, to honor the magnitude of the gift he had been given. As he walked through the quiet corridors of the Vatican, escorted by the Monsignor, Michael felt like he was in a dream. The ancient stones seemed to whisper their secrets, and he could almost feel the presence of all those who had walked these halls before him, centuries of faith and doubt and hope. When he finally stepped outside into the cool night air, Michael took a deep breath. The stars were visible above Vatican City, bright and eternal. He thought about the Pope's words, about love transcending death, about every person mattering, about being present and seeing each other clearly. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and dialed his brother's number. It was late, but he had promised the Pope he would call immediately. James answered on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Michael, what's wrong? It's the middle of the night." "Nothing's wrong," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just need to tell you something important. I need to tell you that I love you, James. I should have said it 1,000 times before, but I'm saying it now. I love you and I'm proud of you and you matter so much to me." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Michael heard his brother's breath catch. "Are you okay?" James asked, concern evident in his voice. "I'm more than okay," Michael replied. "I just spent the day with Pope Francis. He died about an hour ago and I was with him when it happened." "The Pope? Michael, what are you talking about?" Michael found a bench in a quiet corner of the Vatican gardens and sat down. And then he told James everything. He told him about the conversation in the garden 3 years ago, about how the Pope had remembered James's name and prayed for him daily. He told him about the day they had just shared, about all the wisdom and love and humanity he had witnessed. James listened in stunned silence, and when Michael finished, his brother was crying. "He prayed for me?" James said, his voice broken. "A man who never met me prayed for me every day?" "Every single day," Michael confirmed. "He told me to tell you that he's proud of you, that every day you choose life is a victory, that your struggle was not in vain." James sobbed openly over the phone, and Michael let him, understanding that sometimes tears are the only appropriate response to being seen and valued so completely. "I can't believe this," James finally managed to say. "I can't believe any of this is real." "It's real," Michael assured him. "And it changes everything, doesn't it? Knowing that someone cared that much, believed in you that much, even without knowing you." They talked for over an hour, Michael sharing more details, James asking questions, both of them trying to process the extraordinary nature of what had happened. When they finally said goodbye, James made Michael promise to come home soon so they could talk more in person. "I love you too," James said before hanging up. "I should have said it more. I'm going to say it more." "Good," Michael replied. "That's exactly what the Pope would want." After ending the call, Michael sat in the garden for a long time. He thought about his father, about all the unspoken words between them, and he chose to believe what the Pope had told him, that his father had known, that actions could speak love just as clearly as words. He thought about his military career, about all the years he had spent being a uniform instead of a person. He decided that when his current assignment ended, he would take some time to figure out what he really wanted, who he really wanted to be beyond the role he had been playing. Most of all, he thought about the Pope's message, about seeing people, being present, making every interaction matter. He thought about how one brief conversation 3 years ago had changed his life, and how this final day had changed it again. As dawn began to break over Vatican City, the bells started to toll, announcing to the world that Pope Francis had passed away. Michael stood and saluted the window where the Pope's room was located, a final gesture of respect for the man who had taught him that being human was more important than being a perfect soldier. In the weeks that followed, the world mourned the Pope. Millions gathered in St. Peter's Square. World leaders gave speeches. The media covered every aspect of his life and legacy. Michael watched it all from a distance, knowing that he carried something precious that most people would never have, an intimate understanding of who the Pope truly was in his final moments. He was interviewed by Vatican officials about his time with the Pope, and his account was included in the official records, but he kept the most personal moments to himself, treasuring them as sacred gifts meant only for him. Michael did eventually leave military service. He returned to England and started working with young people struggling with addiction, inspired by his brother's recovery and the Pope's belief in second chances. He started each day by trying to really see the people he worked with, to be present with them in their struggles, to show them they mattered. James thrived in his recovery and eventually became a counselor himself, helping others find their way back from the darkness. He kept a picture of Pope Francis on his desk, and he would often tell his clients about the Pope who had prayed for a stranger, who had believed in someone he never met. Michael reconnected with his mother, and they began having real conversations, speaking the words they had always felt but never said. She cried when Michael told her about the Pope's message about his father, and she shared her own regrets and her own journey toward forgiveness. Years passed, and Michael met someone, fell in love, got married. He and his wife had 2 children, and Michael made sure to tell them every day that he loved them. He told them stories about their Uncle James, about their grandfather, and especially about a Pope who had taught him that every person's story matters. On the anniversary of Pope Francis's death each year, Michael would return to Vatican City. He would stand in the gardens where he first met the Pope, and he would spend time reflecting on the lessons he had learned. He would think about presence, about seeing people, about love transcending everything. The message the Pope had asked him to carry forward, Michael shared it whenever he could. Sometimes it was with the young people he counseled, sometimes with strangers he met, sometimes just with his own family. He would tell them about a brief encounter that changed his life, about a dying man who chose to spend his final day teaching a soldier how to be human. People were always moved by the story. Some would cry, some would hug him, some would simply sit in thoughtful silence. But everyone who heard it understood the essential truth at its heart, that we are all connected, that every interaction matters, that love is the most powerful force in the universe. Michael never forgot the feeling of holding the Pope's hand as he died, of being present for that sacred transition. It had taught him that death was not something to fear, but something to approach with grace and peace. When difficult times came in his own life, he would remember the Pope's smile in those final moments, the complete absence of fear, the total presence of love. The Pope had been right. The story did matter. It rippled outward in ways Michael could never have anticipated. People who heard it would share it with others. Some would write about it. It became part of the larger narrative of Pope Francis's legacy, a testament to his belief that every person deserves to be seen and valued. But for Michael, it was more than just a story to share. It was the foundation of how he chose to live his life. Every morning he would wake up and remember the Pope's words, be present, see people, love openly. And every night he would reflect on whether he had lived up to that calling. He wasn't perfect at it. There were days when he was distracted or impatient, when he failed to really see the people around him. But those failures only made him more determined to do better, to honor the gift he had been given by living it fully. James told him once that he thought the Pope had chosen Michael specifically, that it hadn't been random. He knew you would carry the message forward, James said. He knew you would let it change you and then use it to change others. Michael didn't know if that was true, but he liked to think so. He liked to imagine that somehow in that brief conversation 3 years before the